snow of winter, there's a spring that waits to be unrevealed until its season, something God alone can see.
I awoke this morning to one of Beaverton's better headlines. I don't know how many here know the Beaverton, but you should check it out if you don't. It said, Western countries to save Syrians from chemical weapons by bombing them with normal weapons, which I really liked. Today's topic is, what if the Christian right is wrong? And I recognize that I'm not only preaching to the choir here, you're all choir here. I don't think there are too many people from the Christian right worshiping with us. Well, you never know. And I wanted to say two caveats, first of all. Number one, there's a spiritual truth, and that is that you become what you hate. So in no way, shape, or form should we hate the Christian right. In fact, like everyone on this planet, they are our brothers and sisters, but we can criticize them. And number two, there's a real racial difference when you talk about evangelicals. We remember that Martin Luther King was a Baptist, and we know that Judge Roy Moore, the pedophile who ran for office in Alabama, got the votes in the support of 80% of white evangelicals, but 95% of African Americans voted the other way against him. So there's a difference. So when we hear that 40% of the US are evangelicals, it tells us something, but it doesn't tell us a lot. If you contrast that with Canada, there are about 10% evangelicals here. The other thing we need to know is this, those words. First of all, fundamentalists, fundamentalism. They don't get to use that. They shouldn't use that. We're the fundamentalists because we believe in the fundamentals of the gospel, which is that you love your neighbor as yourself, that you build a loving community that is church, and that you do justice in the world. Those are the fundamentals of the Bible and the fundamentals of the gospel. So I'm taking back that word. And we should also take back the word evangelism, because we are also evangelists. Evangelism simply means sharing the good news, being angels, if you will, in the world. We are angels in the world, and we are spreading the good news if we spread the news of the gospel, the fundamentals. So we are evangelists. So we should take back those words, because really when we talk about what's called a Christian right, isn't Christian at all. It's a right-wing political movement that has its origins way back in the days of empire, when Christians, some of them, actually united with empire in Constantinople and decided that it was better to be powerful than it was to be faithful. And you see this resurgence of that brand of so-called Christianity over the years, and we're seeing it now in the United States. There was a wonderful article written by a columnist in the Washington Post, Michael Gerson, and he said, and he's an evangelical, so self-described, he said, if you look at Trump and the Trump gospel, this is what you really see. Blessed are the proud, blessed are the ruthless, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after fame. Trump's, he goes on to say, Trump's contempt for losers, equation of financial success and human worth. These values are the opposite of what I was taught in Sunday school. The opposite. There is nothing Christian about them. Now, I feel like I've been kind of fighting with my brothers and sisters in the Christian right for a long time. It started way back when, even before I became a Christian, and that was in walking young women, as a young woman myself, to Morgenthaler's clinic on Harvard Street back in the day. And walking those women past screaming hordes, sometimes of people with signs, young girls who were making a very difficult decision. It was horrendous. And that was my taste of what I thought Christian was back then. And then later, when I became a Christian, and I had the absolute honor of performing the first legalized same-sex marriage back at my church, Emmanuel Howard Park, then we got it again. In fact, none other than Fred Phelps from Westboro Baptist Church. Now, if you don't know that name, this is a name that should go down in infamy. He's no longer with us. But he's the man, and his church was the church that would turn up to the funerals of AIDS victims with signs that said, "God hates fags." That was Fred Phelps. Now, Fred Phelps noticed us, little old us in Toronto, after that first legalized same-sex marriage, and he began to target us. He wasn't alone. There were lots of others, lots of threats. But I remember his in particular because I kind of liked it. He said, "The lesbian sodomite juggernaut rolls on in Toronto." Now, that's cool. And in fact, the lesbian sodomite juggernaut rolling on, we thought we should have T-shirts made up. Like, that's cool. That's cool. So still, the Christian right and I learned how to negotiate over the issue of same-sex marriage. So there I debate in media, people like Charles McVety, head of the Canadian Christian College, who hasn't gone away, he's still out there, and he was out on the front lawns of Queen's Park protesting the sex ed curriculum, which, by the way, was 10 years too late and had lots of parental input. So there he was, and there were about 1,000 people on the front lawn of Queen's Park when that was put into place. Their signs said it all. Their signs were homophobic, their signs were misogynist, their signs were transphobic. That's what the opposition to the sex ed program looks like in Ontario. And my EA and I went out and we held up the pride flag. There was just the two of us against the 1,000. We felt pretty brave. I wore my collar, because I do, and at that point, some woman came up to me and she said, "How dare you impersonate a priest?" Which I also liked, which is why I wear the collar, because it's a feminist statement and it still freaks people out. It's good. So they've been there, and they've been there for a long, long time. There were other times too, of course, at Queen's Park, when we banned conversion therapy, which was therapy that tries to turn queer kids straight. And you know what? I was surprised that it was still going on, and it is still going on, sadly, in contravention of the law. But when we traveled as a committee around Ontario, we had psychiatrists come and testify before our committee, and that was their entire practice, was trying to turn queer kids straight. Their entire practice. Again, they called themselves Christian. And even when the bill went to committee, there was Charles McVety, yet again, objecting to the bill, yet again, and many, many others. The same with parent equality, the same with trans rights, Toby's Law that was named after our music director at Emmanuel Howard Park, and the same with Trans Day of Remembrance. They were there at every point, objecting to what we were doing in the name of civil rights. And they're still there. And I was very saddened to hear in the conservative debates here, Christine Elliott, who I actually co-authored 3 of 4 of those bills with, pandering to that religious right on the issue of sex ed, which is code. It's just a code topic designed to placate them. So what that tells me is they're still out there, still lots of them out there, and there's still work for us to do. Because this tradition of the Christian right aligning itself with power for power's sake, and that's what it's about, and the social gospel movement, which is where the United Church finds itself, and which has also been there since the beginning of Christianity, have always kind of moved forward together. We need to talk to each other. And by the way, we should be incredibly proud as Canadians that liberation theology didn't originate in South America or Central America. It actually originated in Canada, out on the prairies, with theologians like Ben Smiley. And when we think of, people like Tommy Douglas, a Baptist minister, we think of someone who espoused the social gospel. And the social gospel is simply the gospel. It is that statement that the fundamentals of our faith are to love our neighbor as ourselves, and in doing so, to reach out and to assist our neighbor, to be there for our neighbor, and that there is something to this building heaven on earth, as well as looking at perhaps heaven not of this earth. So that's the other difference, is that it's not just about pie in the sky when we die, it's actually about pie here for everyone equally divided. That's the social gospel movement. And that, I would argue, that's Christ's message. That is Christ's message. Today we're welcoming new members, and that's exciting. Despite the sleet, despite the powers and principalities, we're welcoming new members. Because one of the things that the Christian right has got going for us that we don't have going for ourselves in many United Churches across this country is growth. And I think there's a conversation to be had there too. And the conversation is to be had with our secular brothers and sisters, that we are not them, and that power message, that power-hungry message that they espouse is not what we espouse, that the Christian right is wrong, and that true Christianity is something very different from that. When you think of Jesus, for example, you think of the worst evangelist in terms of numbers of all time. I mean, he had a ministry that was about 3 years long. If you read the Gospels, he was only around for about 3 years. He was very young when he died. He took his congregation from a high of about 5,000 members, the feeding of the 5,000, and by the time he died, he whittled it down to a handful of people and almost lost all of those in 3 years. That ain't church growth. That's pretty grim. That's evangelism too. That's called faithfulness. And in this beautiful story that we heard this morning from Luke, and in the story last week from John, we see what the risen Christ looks like. He looks like the gardener, or he looks like the person who's sharing dinner with us, who's having a piece of fish. I like to think, if they had headlines back then, it would be, Jesus Christ walks out of tomb, eats fish, But it's very simple. That's where we meet the risen one, in the most ordinary of circumstances, and probably on a daily basis. That's the Christ we meet. That's the Christ who is alive. Finally, our brothers and sisters in the Christian right, and in fact, the plethora of denominations that are different from ours, who are our brothers and sisters, there is a joke. And it was originally told as a rabbi, but I'm going to Christianize it because it works just as well in our faith. So there's this new clergy person. She comes into a congregation, and when the gospel is read, half the congregation stand up, and the other half sit down, and they mumble at each other, and then they fight with each other. And this happens every Sunday, and it happens at every board meeting, because the ones that stand say, it is the tradition of this congregation that we stand when the gospel is read. And the ones that sit down say, no, it's not. It's idolatry. It is the tradition of this congregation that we sit when the gospel is read. She gets awfully tired of this, so she decides to look up the minister who was there before. He was there for decades, and he's now in long-term care, for good reason. And she goes to see him, and she says to him, so I have a question for you. Is it the tradition of the congregation for everybody to stand when the gospel is read? And he shook his head. No, no, he said. Oh, she said, thank goodness. Is it the tradition then? It is the tradition, right? That they all sit when the gospel is read. And he said, no, 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 no. And now she's confused. And she says, but here's what's happening. You know, when the gospel is read, some stand and some sit and they fight with each other. And he said, yes, that's the tradition. So, prayers as we go forth into this world, prayers that we meet each other as sister and brother, no matter what our faith backgrounds and no matter what our take on the gospel. Pray that we keep the conversation going. It's so important that we speak to those who are different from us and those who don't agree with us. And trust me, if Doug Ford gets a majority government, I will be back at Queen's Park and I will talk to Christine Elliott. So do this lovingly, knowing full well that we have a Jesus who eats fish and gardens, a Jesus who walks among us, a Christ who is where we are, and a Christ who loves his neighbor as himself, as we love our neighbors as ourselves, and who goes out into the world to bring the good news of the gospel to everyone. Amen.